Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our reading through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We turn now to one of the most anthologized poems in all of the Johnson collection, and that's the text that we are working with. This is poem number 214, I Taste a Liquor Never Brewed. One of Emily's often considered the favorite poems of Emily Dickinson. I think there's a lot of reasons for this, and I think there's a lot more going on in this poem than we often will immediately recognize. But this is one of the few poems that Emily sent to Sam Boyles that he published. He published this one in the Springfield Daily Republican for May of 1861. He called it The May Wine, and we'll see that that's a pretty useful title. Although I think there's some other things going on here that maybe even Boyles himself didn't fully appreciate. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've already worked through our set of introductory comments. I'm hopeful that you've worked through the preceding 213 poems, because if you have, then you come to this poem, and we just finished with 213, did the Herbal Looser Girdle. If you come to this poem with all those previous poems in mind, then we will have seen already this kind of exuberant voice, this powerful energy that Emily can sometimes play with, especially as it relates to nature itself. Now, it's often a question of what is she actually talking about. Many will just read this poem. I think it's one of the reasons why it's so popular, because it's so accessible. Clearly, Emily is doing a Scooby Snack dance, a Snoopy dance for nature and her love of nature, how beautiful the world of nature is. But I think there's something else going on here beneath the surface, and I think it has to do with Emily's view of the act of creativity itself, and I'll see if I can help us to get there. Note the really kind of almost like comic spirit of this one. It is a tribute to the beauty and the power of nature. Emily is sometimes referred to as a romantic because of a poem like this, and I think there's a lot of Emerson hiding behind this. Emerson's Bacchus, the great poem that celebrates nature, I think is in some ways behind this. The idea of maybe limitless optimism will remind us that in our discussions about Walt Whitman and our talks with Walt, as we called our readings through all of the poems of the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass, you'll remember that I came back to that notion that he said several times, he said that he wanted to walk on the sunny side of life, and we'll certainly play the game here. There is as well something about the word reeling in this poem and the country dance called the reel, and I think there is powerful energy in this poem, and it's one of the reasons I think why so many people are attracted to Emily's stuff. Now it is again amazing that Emily can have these really mournful, lugubrious kinds of poems, and then she can have a poem like this. I taste a liquor never brewed from tankards scooped in pearl. Not all the vats upon the Rhine yield such an alcohol. Inebriate of air am I, and debauchee of dew, reeling through endless summer days from inns of molten blue, when landlords turn the drunken bee out of the foxglove's door, when butterflies renounce their drams, I shall but drink the more, till seraphs swing their snowy hats and saints to windows run to see the little tippler leaning against the sun. Now, there were critiquers of this poem that said, wait a minute, pearl doesn't rhyme with alcohol. And early reviewers of this poem, in fact, wanted to somehow change that last word to find a word that would in fact rhyme with pearl. I find it ironic that that would be the level that we would begin to scrutinize early on a poem like this, when in fact, the beauty of this poem is the energy of this poem. Can we just say that out loud to start with? Notice, she'll begin with what she loves to taste. Emily is about the five senses. Emily is about understanding the power of smell, of touch, and here of taste. Notice, it is a liquor never brewed. Now, when we get to poem 252, we're going to play around again with this idea of liquor, and I'll want to remind you when we get there of this one. She says, I can wade grief whole pools of it. I'm used to that. But the least push of joy breaks up my feet, and I tip, drunken, let no pebble smile. 'Twas the new liquor, that was all. And then the poem goes on, power's only pain. We'll see this use of the word liquor as well when we meet poems 473, 1101, and 1753. Now, we should say this out loud. When Emily writes a poem like this, there is no question that the Puritan tradition against alcohol and drinking was standing behind a whole lot of what she says. You could, and many probably did, early on read this poem as Emily says, I don't need normal liquor or alcohol because I have this amazing thing called nature. Notice she says, I drink a liquor never brewed. Now, there's a whole reading of this poem, and I think it's a more sophisticated reading of the poem that says that in the end, Emily is really talking about the power of the creative vision and the force and the origination of the creative vision. Go back to some of the things we said in Percy Bysshe Shelley's Defense of Poetry at learnstrong.net, where he talks as well about the provocative nature of inspiration and where it comes from. Notice, I taste a liquor never brewed. In other words, you can't make this up. From tankard scooped in pearl, we're back to the pearl of the previous poem, 212. Notice the imagery of that scooped in pearl. And then, not all the vats upon the Rhine. There is a rendering of this that Frankfurt berries instead of vats upon the Rhine. And you'll remember Rhine from poem 123. Yield such an alcohol. And again, some idiot reviewer made the observation that, well, alcohol and pearl don't rhyme. We need a better rhyming. But I think alcohol is the perfect word here. In other words, that word stands with liquor to represent what normal people use to try and find some kind of ecstatic high. She says, I don't need any of that because I am inebriate of air. And of course, this notion of just the joy of being alive. Notice that the language here is not I am, to play around with the biblical reference from Exodus, but rather am I. Inebriate of air. Debauché of dew is exactly the phrase you'll remember from poem 128. It's the only other time. And then I think the key word of the entire poem is this word, reeling. Now, we're going to see this word two more times. When we hit poem 1466, she'll play it like this in poem 1466. She'll say it this way. One of the ones that Midas touched, who failed to touch us all, was that confiding prodigal, the reeling oriole, the bird that's reeling. And then when we get to poem 1628, we'll play it this way. A drunkard cannot meet a cork without a reverie, and so encountering a fly this January day, Jamaicas of remembrance stir that send me reeling in. The moderate drinker of delight does not deserve the spring. Of juleps part are in the jug, and more are in the joy. Your connoisseur in liquors consults the bumblebee. Much has been made of the companion reading of 1628, and certainly when we get there, we'll come back to this poem. Notice she says, inebriate of air, reeling through endless summer days. And there it is, right? I mean, this is what she's doing. She's celebrating majestic summer days. Hurrah, right? And then notice, from ends of molten blue. This is amazing. The blue sky is kind of like hotels. When landlords turned the drunken bee, of course, in the spring, summer, out of the foxglove's door. When butterflies renounce their drams, I shall but drink the more. And it's interesting she would use the word dram. Of course, readers of her poems of that time would immediately go to the dram of evil speech from Hamlet, right, Act 1. And we've given lectures on it at learnstrong.net. But I think that's an intentionally chosen word as well. I shall but drink the more. In other words, and the exclamation point to come with it, we're going to talk about exclamation points, and we're going to point out that in a poem that would deserve lots and lots of exclamation points, we're only going to see two in this poem. We've seen one after alcohol, and then one here after I but drink the more. In other words, the intoxication of nature, the intoxication of a summer day. And now to finish, till, I'm going to keep drinking till seraphs swing their snowy hats. Notice all these S sounds. Seraphs takes us back to poem 138 we've already studied, right? When seraphs swing their snowy hats, is this anti-religious language? Some have said so. And saints to windows run to see the little tippler. I told you she loves this word little in 172 poems, right, to emphasize her own possible fragility. But then notice how she sets it up. The little tippler leaning against the sun. Some say this is the coolest line in all of her poetry. To see this hyperbolic, right? It is hyperbole, obviously. To see her leaning against the sun. She's so taken with a summer day. By the way, There is a rendering of this last line from Manzanella Come. She may be interested in that commercial city port there in southern Cuba. Maybe she was interested in the origination of rum there in one version of that. Here, though, it's I think it's the better line, leaning against the sun. But do notice, leaning against the dash, sun, dash. Notice an exclamation point. From all these poems that we've been reading, where there's so much exclamation points being used. Notice in this poem of exuberance, she'll only use it twice. Well, what's going on at 2A here? I think her argument is that there's so much to celebrate in nature. Those endless summer days are intoxicating, but then, more importantly, and I think to the reading of this poem, so is the creative process. Again, in 2B, notice the exaggeration. Some have called this a childlike poem, which is why it does kind of often appeal to lots and lots of readers, because it's so accessible, it's so childlike. Leaning against the sun is a wonderful image. We've commented on the absences of quotation marks, or exclamation marks there. Only 2. At 3A, poems 298, 486, 657, 613, and then we already worked with 1628. All of those are companion reads to this poem. I very much recommend that you run those to ground. We'll certainly come back to this. We've mentioned already Emerson's poem, Bacchus. You can run that one to ground. I don't want to mention Wordsworth's My Heart Leaps Up When I Behold a Rainbow in the Sky. We've commented on this at learnstrong.net. It's a profound poem. Do you remember how that one ends? So was it when my life began, so is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow older, let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. And I think that notion of natural piety is in fact what Emily is gesturing at here with I taste a liquor never brewed. And then I'd also like to take you to Keats's Ode to a Nightingale. Go back and see what we have to say about that one at learnstrong.net. And then notice that celebration of all the senses as it's related to the end of summer, right? And the celebration here is some... Finally, at 3B, do you love nature this much? That is to say, can you be drunk with nature? Some of us will say absolutely. And in what ways is Emily challenging you to think about inspiration in a similar kind of way? In the end, I guess I can ask it this way, and I hope that the answer is yes. Is Emily making you smile? I certainly hope so. Thank you.